All right, so we want to start with something good. So either unmute your mic or type in the chat what's something good that's going on with you. Okay, we got Brittany says her computer got fixed for free. That's great. There's nothing more frustrating than having a computer that's not working. Believe me, I know. And if you can get it fixed, that's big. But if you can get it fixed for free, that's even great. And Alicia says she's been waking up earlier to do her homework. Okay, so getting that done. All right, last time we were talking about Freud's theories. Oh, before I get going, so that you all know, we're going to finish this chapter 12 on Monday, and then on Wednesday you're going to have a test. And so that test will be in Canvas. So the test will only be open to take for a certain amount of time. So it's not something you can spend days just finding. It's only going to be on Wednesday. And then once you start the test, you're going to have a limited amount of time to take the test. So it's not like you can sit there looking up all the answers and just take your sweet time. So you're going to have to be prepared and ready. So this test will in some ways be similar to the tests you've had before, that there'll be some multiple choice questions and possibly matching, possibly fill in the blank. We'll see. There won't be as many questions as you usually have on the test. There will be at least one essay question. There might be two, but there's not going to be 4 essay questions. So it's going to be similar to the tests you've had in the past, but it will be shorter. All right, so before I go on, are there any questions about the test? Okay, any questions about anything else before we move on? Okay, question is the test chapter 11 and chapter 12? Yes, the test is on chapters 11 and 12. We didn't have a chance to take the test on the other 3 chapters, and we're not going to worry about that. I don't want you to have to go back and have a test on 5 chapters. So the test will only be on chapters 11 and 12. Okay. All right, is everyone seeing the screen, or I just need one person tell me, are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we talked last time about some defense mechanisms because those were important, and guaranteed there'll be questions about defense mechanisms on the test, and possibly that could be one of the essay questions. So someone tell me one of the defense mechanisms. These are things you're going to have to know. Somebody's got to tell me one.
Denial.
Okay, hear a voice, but I can't hear. A little louder.
Denial.
Okay, denial. Okay, remember, denial is not denying that you did something. Denial is refusing to perceive the reality of it. Tell me one more.
Sublimation.
Sublimation. Okay, that's one that's very common for people to use, because got these unmet desires or impulses or frustrations, and so then we use our energy in some productive way. They're getting into our schoolwork or doing sports or hobbies or arts. All right, so there's all the defense mechanisms up there. Before I move on, is there any one that you need any other clarification on? Okay, so now Freud's psychosexual stages. Freud believed that in our unconscious, we have these sexual and aggressive urges, and that we have these things that are unacceptable with societal standards. So that creates a conflict. So he said we go through these stages, and that at each stage, there's a pleasure zone. It's the id's pleasure-seeking energy that's focused on a certain part of the body. So that's called the erogenous zone. So that's the pleasure zone that's associated with each stage. And then he said at each stage, there's some task or something that has to be completed. And if the child's needs at that stage aren't met, or if they're overindulged, so one way or the other, then that child might become fixated at that stage. And so then their personality development doesn't proceed normally at that point. And so a part of his personality or her personality will remain stuck at that stage. All right, we're going to go through each of these stages. The first stage is the oral stage. The erogenous zone is the mouth. So the task is weaning. Can anyone tell me what weaning means? I got a lot of silent people here today. All right, weaning is when we gradually are able to move off of something. And so weaning typically means when the child is brought away from nursing or brought away from using the bottle. So getting off of nursing or getting off of using a bottle. So the first stage is the oral stage. The erogenous zone is the mouth, and the task is weaning from the breast or the bottom. So Freud said if a child is overindulged at this stage, then they become very gullible. So in other words, they swallow anything. So what happens is having to do with the mouth. And so they become dependent or passive. If they're underindulged, then that could lead to them being aggressive. They just want to eat everything up, or sadism, or a tendency to exploit others. So that's how people become sadistic then. He also believed that orally fixated adults may orient their life around their mouth. So that's what would cause them to be overeaters or alcoholics or smoking or talking a great deal. All right, any questions on that before we move on? Okay, the next stage is the anal stage, and that the erogenous zone for the anal stage is the anus, and the task at that stage is toilet training. So if a child becomes fixated at this stage, okay, then that supposedly leads to things that are controlled, like by the anus. So they might become compulsively neat people. So you've probably heard that term before, that somebody's anal. So anal retentive would be somebody who has a very compulsively neat personality. On the other hand, we could go the other way and they would become anal explosive. Not explosive, sorry, anal expulsive, which would be a messy personality, somebody that's disorderly, very rebellious or destructive. Okay, questions before I move on there? All right, the next stage is the phallic stage. The erogenous zone is the genitals, and the task here is overcoming the Oedipus complex. If I could see you all, I would ask you to raise your hand if you knew what the Oedipus complex was. Okay, but the Greek story of Oedipus is a guy who didn't realize it at the time, but ended up having relations with his mother. So the Oedipus complex is when a child is identifying with their same-sex parent, and so looking at their opposite sex parent as if they were in a relationship. So like every little girl wants to grow up and marry her daddy, and every little boy wants to grow up and marry his mommy. So they have this certain kind of misunderstanding, but a kind of, I want to be with mommy like daddy's with mommy. So according to Freud, there's this unresolved sexual longing for that opposite sex parent. And so that's a challenge that has to be developed in those early stages. And so if that's not, then that could lead to long-term resentment towards the same sex parent. And so there are some who hypothesize that this early relationship for a parent may influence the gender identity of a child very early on. Now, that's not something that's proven in any way, because right now we don't know what affects people's gender identities, but that's one theory. So Freud said boys have this Oedipus complex, so they have attraction to their mothers, and he said girls develop an attachment to their fathers, and so they harbor these hostile feelings towards their mothers. And so, again, Freud's theories are very old and very sexist, but according to Freud, then he said because of this resentment that girls blame their mother for a lack of penis. And so Freud said most girls never overcome this, what he called penis envy, and so they give up their rivalry with mothers, and that leads to an enduring moral inferiority in the personality. So now you can see the really sexist part of his theories and why, there's certain parts that aren't still accepted, but certain parts that do lead some credence, like the early feelings towards their opposite sex and same-sex parent, and how that might develop gender identity. The next stage is the latency stage. And so he said there's not an erogenous zone at this point in time, and there's not a conflict that at this point children are just interacting with their same-sex peers. And so he said this is a period of sexual dormancy, and so they don't have these psychosexual conflicts that have to be resolved. And then the final stage is the genital stage. And so the erogenous zone is, again, the genitals. And the task at this stage is establishing intimate relationships. So he said that if at this stage, if we don't learn to establish intimate relationships, then our relationships that we have are based more on lustful desires instead of being based on respect and commitment. Okay, so we have those stages. So I would expect you to know each stage, the erogenous zone, the conflict at each stage. After Freud came Adler, and Adler believed that behavior was purposeful and goal directed. Okay, instead of, as Freud said, that everything is motivated by these unconscious forces. And so Adler believed that we're motivated by our goals in life, especially our goals of obtaining security and overcoming feelings of inferiority. He believed that almost everyone suffers from an inferiority complex, where these deep feelings of inadequacy and incompetence that arise from our feeling of helplessness as infants. So he said these feelings of inferiority lead us to a will to power. Okay, and that will to power can take one of two paths. It can either cause children to develop a superiority over others through dominance or aggression or expressions of envy, or it could cause children to realize their full potential and gain mastery and control in their lives. And so that affects the personality in that way. Another psychoanalytic or psychodynamic follower, but later, was Carl Jung. Carl Jung developed analytical psychology. So like Freud, he emphasized the unconscious processes, but he believed that the unconscious contains both positive and spiritual motives, okay, as well as those sexual and aggressive forces. He also thought that we have two forces of the unconscious mind. He said we have the personal unconscious, and he said this is created from our individual experiences. But Jung theorized that we also have a collective unconscious, and that this is identical in every person, that it's inherited from those who came before us. And so he said that we have that collective unconscious consists of these primitive images and patterns of thoughts and feelings and behavior that he called archetypes. So he said one set of archetypes refer to gender roles. So Jung claimed that both males and females have patterns of feminine aspects of personality, which he called the anima, and the masculine aspects of personality, which he called the animus. And these allow us to express both masculine and feminine traits and to, in some extent, understand the opposite sex. Later came Horney. Okay, so now we have a woman that's still following these Freudian theories. Horney believed that the adult personality was shaped by the child's relationship to the parents, not by some fixation at one of these stages. So she believed that a child whose needs were not met by the nurturing parents would experience these feelings of helplessness and insecurity. So Horney stated that everyone searches for security in one of three ways. We can either move toward people, and we do that by seeking affection and acceptance from others, or we can move away from people by striving for independence or privacy or self-reliance, or we can move against people by trying to gain power and control over others. So Horney said that emotional health requires a balance among these three styles. So she said our personality is a result of our relationship to our parents, and that affects our security. And so we either move toward people, being affectionate, away from people, looking for independence or privacy, or against people by trying to gain power and control over others. Okay, I'm not going to expect you to know the criticisms, but things that when we're talking about unconscious that people don't realize there, that's very difficult to test. So that's one of the big criticisms, and so we don't have that support of these Freudian theories. And then sexism, okay, that's a big knock on Freudian theory, that it's really derogatory towards women and that there's not a lot of cross-cultural support. But despite that, there's still today the emphasis on unconscious and its influence on our behavior. We still look at the conflict between the id, the ego, and the superego. And of course, as I mentioned, defense mechanisms are something that's widely accepted today. And so Freud, during the Victorian era, got people to begin to talk about sex. So that was something. And then he developed psychoanalysis, which is still an influential form of therapy today. And then, unlike many other theories, just the sheer magnitude of Freud's theories are amazing. Okay, we have the iceberg theory on the 3 levels of consciousness. So now, for a moment, I want everybody to turn on their microphones. And I want somebody to tell me one of the levels of consciousness, one of the levels of the psyche.
Is one of
Sorry, kind of cut out. So the conscious is one level. What's another level?
unconscious.
The unconscious is the deepest level. And what's the level between?
Pre-conscious.
The pre-conscious, yes. So that's the iceberg theory. The conscious, those are rare pre-conscious that are just below awareness, and the unconscious, okay, which are things we are not aware of. All right, what's the first stage in his psychosexual stages of development?
Oral.
Yes. What's the second stage? Big clue on the screen there. What's the second stage?
Anal.
Yes. What's the third stage? We're lacking the third stage. Okay, what's the fourth stage?
Latency.
The latency. And what's the last stage? It's kind of right there on the screen. First word in that last box.
Genital.
Yes, the genital stage. All right, so those are the 4 stages. All right, the phallic stage, again, if we were in class, I'd ask you to raise your hand and ask how many people actually know what a phallus is. And probably not too many people at your age know what a phallus is, okay? A phallus is an image of a penis. And so that's why this stage is called the phallic stage. Okay, and so we have references to that in certain things, even in Shrek when the donkey was talking about the little king with his big spires overcoming certain things. That was reference to those big spires being phallic symbols or symbols of a penis. All right, so again, I expect you to know the stage, the erogenous zone, and the task for each stage. All right, I talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. Each of those operates on a principle. What's the principle that the id operates on?
Pleasure.
Yes, pleasure. What principle does ego operate on?
Reality.
Reality. And what principle does the superego operate on?
Morality.
Yes, morality. Okay. All right. The next group of theories are the trait theories. Okay, traits, when we talk about a personality trait, the trait is a relatively stable and consistent characteristic that's used to describe someone. So trait theorists were interested in discovering which traits best describe people and in measuring the degree of variation in those traits. So the early psychologists like Alport got really carried away with traits. So he said there's 4,500 words in the dictionary that describe personality traits. And so he arranged people's personalities into hierarchies with the most important and pervasive traits at the top of that hierarchy. Then other psychologists came around and using a kind of factor analysis and grouping large arrays into basic units, people like Cattell condensed that list of traits to about 30 to 35 basic characteristics. And then Eysenck came along and reduced that list even further. He described the personality as a relationship among three basic types of traits: introversion and extroversion, neuroticism and psychoticism, or aggressive and interpersonal hostility. So then combining all of that research and looking at all these long lists of personality traits, researchers discovered that there's 5 traits that come up repeatedly. Okay, even when there's different kinds of tests that were used. And so they came up with the 5-factor model. So the 5-factor model has 5 personality traits. When we describe personality, we describe somebody being high or low in this trait. So being high or low isn't good or bad. It's just, an area of where you are in that personality. There is one trait that when we get to it, we'll see you don't really want to be at one end of the scale. But for the rest of them, being at one end of the scale or the other is not a good or a bad thing. It's just a description of the personality. All right, so the first factor is openness. Okay, people who are at the high end of the scale of openness tend to be original, imaginative, they're curious, they're open to new ideas, they tend to be artistic, and they're very interested in cultural pursuits. People who are at the low end of openness tend to be very conventional and down-to-earth people. Okay, they're very narrower in their interest. Okay, and they don't want to be looking at everything. They know what they want to be interested in, and so they focus on those things, and so they tend to not be artistic. Critical thinkers tend to be higher on this scale than others. The next factor in the 5-factor model is conscientiousness. So this ranges from people who are responsible, self-disciplined, organizing at the high end, to people at the low end tend to be more irresponsible or more careless, more impulsive, lazy, and undependable. The next factor is extroversion. Okay, people at the high end are sociable, outgoing, talkative, okay, tend to be more affectionate. People at the low end tend to be more introverted people. So they tend to be more withdrawn, quiet, and reserved. The next factor is agreeableness. Okay, individuals who score high in agreeableness tend to be good-natured, warm, gentle. They tend to be cooperative. They tend to be trusting of other people, helpful. People at the low end tend to be more irritable, more argumentative, more ruthless. They're more suspicious of other people. They tend to be more uncooperative and vindictive. The last factor is the one that we really want to be at one end other than the other, and that's neuroticism. Okay, neuroticism is the emotional stability. So people who score high in neuroticism are emotionally unstable. Okay, they're more prone to insecurity, anxiety, guilt, worry, and moodiness. People at the low end of neuroticism are emotionally stable, calm, even-tempered, easygoing, and relaxed. All right, so we have these 5 factors. And of course, you know, people aren't generally at the total one end of the scale or the other. They're somewhere within that scale. And so all of these things make up the personality. So we want to remember these traits. And why do you think I put the picture on this slide to help us remember these traits? If I look at the first letter of each of the factors, that spells ocean. And so ocean helps us remember the 5 factors of the 5-factor model. All right, if we were in a class, what I would do as an exercise, which is a little hard to do here, I would blow up this picture that has the characteristics of high and low scores. And then I'd ask you to put a dot on where you feel you fall on the scale of each of those characteristics. And then by a show of hands, I'd ask people, okay, how many people have their dots kind of more towards the extreme, and how many people have their dots more towards the middle of each one? Okay, so we can see that, you know, it's not like we're totally at one end or the other, but we're somewhere in that scale, and we tend to be more towards one way or the other, more towards the low end or more towards the high end. And so this makes up a lot of different unique personalities. The next thing I would have done is ask you to put on that scale a little X where you think your ideal mate would fall. Okay, and then we'd compare, you know, how many people have their ideal mate are more towards the extremes than to the middle, and how many have their ideal mate has traits that are close to theirs or close to their dots where their personality is, or how many are way different. So these are things to, you know, look at and consider. All right, researchers asked 10,000 men and women from 37 different countries what they wanted in a mate. So they found a high degree of agreement between what men and women wanted. And some of the 5-factor traits were right there at the top. So there's a little list of what men want in a mate, what women want in a mate, okay? You can see the top 4 are the same. Both men and women said they're looking for mutual attraction, love, a dependable character, emotional stability and maturity, and a pleasing disposition. After that, the men said we're looking for good health, education and intelligence, sociability, a desire for home and children, some refinement and neatness, and lastly, good looks. Women said that their next traits they wanted in a man were education and intelligence, that was higher up, sociability, good health, a desire for home and children, ambition and industriousness, and a certain refinement and neatness. So people are looking for a lot of the same traits, men and women, looking for a lot of those same kind of things. So the top 4 being matched perfectly, and then the next 6 having a lot of the same things, just in a different order. All right, so when you took that online personality test, one of the things you could look at was careers. And that's one of the things that we do research a lot. Are there personality types that match with certain careers? And so we find that there is. And in fact, there's certain positions, I know that there are certain companies that if you're applying for a management position, they give you one of these kinds of personality tests to see if your personality characteristic matches what's typical for a manager or that type of leadership position. And some companies at that point, if you don't have the personality characteristic that matches, your application would be finished at that point. They'd say, thank you very much, you're not what we're looking for. So that's an interesting use of personality characteristics. Of course, I know great leaders may have some different characteristics, so who knows, they may be missing out on some great people. All right, I'm not going to go through each of these. You can always come back to the slide. Of course, the slides are on my website, so you don't have to play through a whole video, but you can come back to the slide and look at the different personality characteristics, what kind of personality type Holland said those are, and then what kind of matching occupation might go along with that. So that's something to consider. I think theorized that traits interact. So we saw this with emotions before, okay? That, a couple of emotions interact to give us a different kind of emotion. So Ising said the same thing with personality traits, that when we have these traits like being moody and reserved and unsociable, and we mix those with the restlessness and aggressiveness and impulsiveness, that we get an unstable personality. But when we mix the moody and reserved and unsociable with somebody who's thoughtful, controlled, reliable, we have that introverted personality type. If we mix the restless and impulsiveness with somebody who's sociable and talkative, okay, we get an extroverted personality type. When we match the peaceful, controlled, calm traits with somebody who's talkative and outgoing, we get a stable personality type. So he's saying certain mixtures of things give us certain traits. All right, so the pros are that we can describe personality without getting all carried away with all kinds of descriptions. We're using the fewest possible traits. And then we have degrees in each of those traits, which can give us a lot of variety. The con is that we don't have an explanation of what causes these personality traits. In Freud, he had each trait, but he gave a reason or a cause of how we developed that. So here we don't have any cause. We just have, well, here's a personality trait. Don't know where they came from, but here they are. We don't have any explanation of that stability versus change. Do these traits endure over time, or does our personality change? It ignores the situational effects. So some people might have a personality that, they're going to be very introverted in certain situations, but they may be very outgoing in other situations. Okay, so as an example, you look at me as your teacher, you see in that classroom, I interact with you, I'm teaching the lesson, okay? But in another situation where I'm just sitting around with a group of people, I might be a very quiet individual. So there's different situations in which we may behave differently. And then when we look at human beings, the great variations of personality are really kind of hard to account for in 4 or 5 traits. Okay, what's the word for the relatively stable personal characteristics that we use to describe someone? Okay, those are traits. What's the word that we can use to remember the 5 traits from the 5-factor model?
Ocean.
Very good. Ocean. So what's O?
Openness.
What's C? What's C?
Conscientiousness.
Yes. What's E?
Extroversion.
Yes. What's A?
Agreeableness.
Yes. And what's N? Not hearing anybody. What's N?
Neuroticism.
Yes. Okay. Which of those traits identifies somebody tending to be withdrawn, quiet, passive, or reserved?
Extroversion.
Yes, extroversion, because on one end we're the talkative, on the other end we're reserved. Okay, good. Okay. On Monday, we're going to finish up chapter 12 with a few other theories on personality. And then on Wednesday, you're going to have a test. I'm going to have that test open only for a limited time. What would be helpful is if you emailed me and said, yeah, I'm good from, all day, or no, my parents have to use the computer at this time and I can't be on the computer from 1 to 4 or something. And that will help me identify when is a good time to open up this test. Okay, so it's not going to be just open all day long. It's only going to be open for a specific time period. And once you open the test, you will only have a certain amount of time to complete it before it cuts you off. Okay, before we conclude, any questions or comments today?
On Wednesday, are we still going to have a lecture, or are we only going to take the test?
On Wednesday, you're only going to take a test. So we're not going to meet live on Wednesday because that's going to be a test day. Okay. If you have any other questions, you can always, email me, ask the question, but please email me and tell me if you're free all day, if there's a certain time period. I may not be able to, accommodate a time period that would have everyone, but if I could, that would be great. But certainly, one of the requirements is once you start, you'll only have a limited time to complete the test. Okay? All right. Miss seeing you guys. But, hang in there. You're doing great. And I will talk to you again on Monday.
Thank you.
Welcome. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.